Hello, and welcome to the discussion after the screening of the film Making Waves. I really hope that you can hear me well. It would be such an embarrassment if not, since we will talk about the art of cinematic sound. My name is Dominik Vontor, and I'm coordinator of KineDok, which is an alternative distribution platform organized by Institute of Documentary Film. And thanks to the US Embassy and to Initiative American Film Showcase, we are able to offer to you to watch for free documentary Making Waves. If you haven't seen the film, you still have the chance after an easy registration in our Google form. I really hope that you will enjoy this talk, this little conversation, and also many other discussions and screenings that we plan to offer to you in this strange online period in our lives. You can find our full program on our website, kinedok.net, or on our Instagram and Facebook. I would like to welcome here our wonderful guests who join our discussion today. First of all, I would like to welcome here Ms. Bobette Baster, who is producer and screenwriter of the film Making Waves, The Art of Cinematic Sound. Bobette, she is a lecturer at UCS School of Cinematic Arts and Northeastern University. She's also a script coach for such great companies like Pixar, Disney, Google, or Sony. She collected all her knowledge, personal knowledge and industry knowledge in her wonderful book, Do Story, How to Tell the Story So the World Listens, which I really recommend to everyone who is aspiring writer or storyteller. So welcome here, Bobette, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me. I had a wonderful season of being in Prague in '96, where I taught, I think it was a 6 or 8 week course at FAMU several times a week. And we had a wonderful Sunday evening viewing party with food and drink. And then I stayed on for 2 months in Prague, and it was a remarkable experience for me. I have such fond memories.
Wow, that's so nice to hear about Prague, because here in Prague, here with me is also our second guest, Pavel Rejholec, who is managing director of Czech sound production and post-production facility Sound Square that covers a wide range of the sound services. Pavel is also multiple winner of Best Sound Awards, and he is the head of the Department of Sound Design at the Czech FAMU School in Prague. So welcome, Pavel, as well, and thank you very much for joining.
Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me to this kind of great event. And thanks, Bobette, for your film, because I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Before we start, let me encourage you, the viewers, to ask the questions in the comment section below this video stream. I will be very happy to ask them and to tell them to our wonderful guests. Let me start, Bobette, asking you, first of all, thank you as well for this wonderful film, this like amazing insight into the world of movie sound and into the work of those amazing sound men and women and their history. Maybe can you tell us, just for the context, something about the production of the film? Because I know that the director of the film, Mitch Costin, she worked in the sound department for several years, but actually I don't know your story. What interested you in the topic of sound film? And how difficult was it to approach those wonderful filmmakers that are being in your film? So can you tell me what role did you play in making this movie?
Well, what happened was I was a graduate student at USC School of Cinema, and my teacher at the time for film production was Jay Roach, who went on to become, the director of Austin Powers and Recount and Bombshell. So he has had a big career in Hollywood. But at the time, he was a film instructor. And we were supposed to make short films. And one morning, he brought in a lecture on sound design. And, what do we know? We think, oh, it's just equipment that you have to record properly, make sure you, put the boom in the right place and all that. And what he did was he showed The Elephant Man by David Lynch, and showed how David Lynch, working with Alan Splett, his sound designer, created the inner life of the Elephant Man in such an extraordinary way, and created an arc of transformation of the Elephant Man's horrible life when he was a carnival freak. And then when he's finally brought into the hospital, how he is restored to his own dignity And this horrible sound design transitions to this phenomenal orchestral music, Samuel Barber's Adagio. And he showed us many of the complexities of thinking about how do you use sound as a story tool. And it blew my mind wide open. I had no idea that sound could be used that way. And literally from then on, I was watching films with a whole other dimension. And some of the films were brilliant. I suddenly realized something's going on here. They're making choices to make us feel an immersive story experience in a different way. And some films, it was just about having good quality sound. And they relied heavily on music. So I began to notice the difference between music and sound design. And then I started lecturing around the world, and I couldn't give students, in America, you give students a script, you have them read the script, they watch the movie, you talk about it and teach it in a different way. But when I brought it to Europe, and it was that season in which I also came to Prague, I would deconstruct the movies literally almost frame by frame and say, well, this is how, it's not just the script and the director and the actors, it's also the sound designer, production design, costume, lighting. And everyone who saw this, who experienced sound design for the first time, they went, wow, it was like their ears opened. And so that led to a whole series I did at Pixar. And who should be in the audience but Gary Rydstrom, who had won 7 Oscars for sound design, working with Steven Spielberg and Robert Redford and others. And I was like, oh my God, why is he one of my students? So I went up to him and I said, Mr. Rydstrom, if you don't agree with anything I'm saying. And he said, oh, I love it. He said, I'm glad you put this all together. So he said, let's go to lunch. And so we did. And I said very cheekily, how come you all haven't done a documentary? We need something that would explain this succinctly in like an hour and a half. He said, well, we're pretty busy. But he said, I'll back you to do it. And he said, I will introduce you to all the major players, George Lucas, Spielberg, John Lasseter, Robert Redford, and all the major sound designers like Walter Murch and Ben Burtt. And with that offer, I knew I had the possibility of doing the documentary. Mm-hmm. And then he said, why don't you partner with Midge Costin at USC, because she's the head of the sound department. She's worked in the sound field as an editor. And so we got together, and then I brought in my partner, Karen Johnson, who had done a great documentary on stunt women, in Hollywood. And so that's what we did. I will say that it took us 10 years, 6 years of actual production. We had over 200 hours worth of interviews, 50 interviews. And a big issue, there were 2 big issues with this. One being, we had to use actual film clips because how are you going to get people to experience sound, right? But that's expensive. And no one had done the documentary because the rights to all those clips was prohibitive. But I became involved with a group of lawyers in the entertainment business. And we went to Washington, D.C. and appealed to the Library of Congress. There's an actual librarian. For this, it's called fair use. I think in Europe, it's called fair dealing. We appealed for the right to use clips for free in our movie if we transformed them. And if we said, hey, we're using this clip to reveal something to you. Mm-hmm. And so we got this exemption. And in the end, it took a long time, and we had to get a legal opinion on it and buy insurance. And at that point, we have now about 1,000 clips and archival materials in the film. That includes also photographs and things. So that took quite a while to work out. And then we just had to be on the schedule of these great directors. They were busy. So we were waiting and waiting and waiting for a lot of those interviews. And there's some fun stories I could tell you about that as well. So,
wow, that's really wonderful. How many hours did you shoot? But your film focuses mainly on the American history or the Hollywood history of a sound design, and it absents some of the European practices, maybe Asian practices in different genre. And I'm happy that we have Pavel here, because I know that from your perspective, you mostly work in this American collective workflow. But maybe can you describe or identify the biggest differences between the approaches of sound designers and sound mixers in Europe and in the United States?
Well, I would say that the basic approach would be the same. It's about to create the best sound for the film or the project you are working on. But obviously there are differences, especially in European cinema. It's quite often that you don't have a full team of 16, 20 people working on that movie. You have very kind of small, intimate movies where you could have just one sound editor, perhaps a re-recording mixer, and that's it basically. And that there is very close relation with the director. And on the other hand, it can take a year or more working on such movie. On the other hand, you have productions which are very close to the American style, so to speak. So you have supervising sound editor and mixer, and you have lots of editors. Everybody does his bit. It means ambiences. Another one does sound effects. Another one does Foley, etc., etc. But I would say that definitely, if you, for example, if you watch titles or credits for the films in French cinema, you see usually there are at least two main titles, which are in the main title sequence. There is like the person who recorded the sound, location sound mixer, and there is a person who mixed the sound, re-recording mixer. So in European cinema or European projects, you usually have like two people who are considered to be authors of the sound. In American cinematography, it's very much different. They take a location sound mixer as it's usually a more technical oriented person who records the sound. Obviously, he gets the credit, but the main guy is someone like Gary Wrightstrom, who is the sound designer with the big S, and he then basically has all the responsibility for the sound with the producers. And also there's difference in America or in US productions. Producers have much bigger say. In Europe, it's usually the director who has the biggest say. So there are various differences, but I think that the main goal of everybody is to have the best sound possible in the conditions which he has. Obviously, the budgets differ quite a lot.
Well, yeah, mainstream big Hollywood productions have more money, and the little art house films have less. And one of the issues with making the film was what we always heard is, there's this term, if there's a problem on the set in production, they will say, we will fix it in post. And then what happens, they spend all the money in production and they go over and they have, issues. And when they get the post, they have no more money. So there's, I remember Danny Boyle saying when he was starting out with his low budget films in Great Britain, he said he knew that he could add so much production value in sound. And so he made sure to protect the post-production budget.
Yeah, I would like more directors like that.
Yeah, because it really adds whole layers of emotion and to a story, and people don't know it, and you want them not to know it. You want them to be immersed in the world of the story. I want to just insert something here. We really wanted to do European and international films, and we have all these extra interviews where we explore that. So we had hopes we could perhaps do a series. We're hoping to do a podcast series soon in which we're going to show excerpts. We're going to put excerpts of our interviews out on special topics like animation, also the field of bioacoustics. But our hope was to move into international cinema and show the work that's being done around the world.
Yeah, the film shows this kind of like a hard work behind the sound persons and directors in 40s, 60s, 70s. And as you mentioned, Pavel, also in the sense of negotiating with the producers and with the cinemas, in a sense of budget and the time spending. And those men and women that you show in the film, Bobette, are the real pilgrims of the sound design.
Yeah.
But when I think about the European approach, which seems more, let's say, individualistic with the smaller crew, it also reminds me of the work of independent American filmmakers such as Jim Jarmusch, Tarantino, John Cassavetes. Maybe have you followed the journey of their work with the sound, and maybe how their usage influenced the storytelling and the use of sound?
Yeah, we have in our extra footage, a lot of, 200 hours, a lot of interviews on lower budget films, especially like documentaries. Mm-hmm. Certainly working with Quentin Tarantino, he's very loyal to his team and his relationships, especially early on, like Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, just as he was ascending into his power base. Quentin had a great sense of both sound design and music that was provocative and interesting and unexpected, as did like Danny Boyle and many others. But we had a whole section on, and there's no more low budget thing than documentaries. But now that we're in a golden era of documentary filmmaking, and we're showing what sound design and proper sound mixing can do to elevate the whole story of documentaries, because you're obviously in different situations constantly and picking up different issues on the fly in documentary. And so the whole role of what sound can do to elevate that experience is so critical. So yes, we had a whole section on, low budget filmmaking, which would be great to do because that's what most people are dealing with, particularly when they're starting out, and also with short films.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I really love from the story in Making Waves is that it also teaches us this kind of a general history of influences in media between a radio and between the film. So we find out that the film sound has its roots in the radio. It was Orson Welles, which is included in your film, who most famously dramatized what the listeners can hear. In 60s, the film sound was inspired by the music industry when adapting to stereo and Dolby systems. Maybe my question is, what kind of inspiration finds film sound today? What affects it the most? If it was music in the 60s, if it was radio in 40s, what is it now?
I want to add to that animation, it was really Walt Disney, who is such a pioneer in so many ways. We had a whole animation section we ended up cutting down and would love to do a sequel about it. But when Walt Disney was starting out, he did a whole project about a rabbit called Oswald Rabbit and went across the United States. This is 1926 to present it on a big theater, and it was a huge success. And then the man who had commissioned it came up to Walt and said, well, thank you very much. We'll take it from here. You're fired. And on the way back, Walt's devastated. He'd put all his passion into this wonderful character, Oswald Rabbit. He'd had to take a train all the way back to California. And he suddenly realized, well, I can do something. I will make a mouse. And then he, with Ub Iwerks, who was his real animator, and Walt was the big visionary mind, they went into a barn and created sound effects. And that was just shocking how exciting that was to the audience. And from then on, that was a huge innovation. Animation came alive. But today, I don't know. I mean, I think we're all so used to phenomenal sound experiences in the mainstream cinema, and we're not in the cinema. Mm-hmm. And I think that, people are getting a much more inspiration from, nature is coming alive in whole new ways. During the pandemic, we're so much quieter. And I think the sound designers have been through an era of creative mixing, listening in a new way, And nothing, I think it was Pavel, you said that every sound you hear is a lie in cinema. Do you want to talk about that? You can explain it to them.
Yeah, a little bit. I think you are basically showing it in your movie that if somebody who is not sound professional asks me about the film, they usually think what they see or what they hear, better to say, is what was recorded on set. And I said, no, it's lie. The only thing which you hear from the set is dialogue, and that's it. Everything else has been added and mixed and completely redesigned, and it's the biggest surprise and it's the biggest revelation of them all, that it's basically all created to sound like it is natural. And what I always like to say is that if you record a sound and just play it back, it doesn't sound real, it doesn't sound natural. It has to be tweaked and designed so the audience thinks it's natural. It's kind of perception which we have been trained to because of the years we have been listening to films and television. Because for me now, high-end television is pretty much on the same level like the feature films. It's just different means of delivery, but we have been trained to listen to it, and we believe to the soundtracks because they look real and it's basically all designed. So that's the biggest revelation which you can see in your film, I think, and that's the most important aspect of it for me.
Also, and also there's the idea of things are not, the emotionality of sound. I think that for me was the greatest understanding I had, was how we feel in a moment. Sound is affecting us in a different way. So how do you, as a storyteller, create that feeling from sound? And some of it's fun, like Gary Rydstrom would talk about, he had to create the sound for T-1000 in Terminator 2, this creature who, can go through iron bars and then becomes whole again. You thought, what sound will that be? And it was while he was feeding his dog and heard the dog food come out of the can, and it was a slurping sound, but metallic. And that was a sound effect, he said, that cost 35 cents, whereas all the visual effects cost millions of dollars. But that is such an evocative moment. And so what you often hear is how creative sound designers are, because they're listening to the world for an alternate way of expressing themselves. And I know now that, my ears are sort of popped open and I listen for I don't listen for it, I hear crazy sounds and I think, oh, that's the feeling of something else,
Yeah,
and,
you're right. You can train your ears to the sound. That's obviously what we all do. But there is one very interesting aspect in all that. And that's, I would say that in the film where you have sound and visual, the most emotional part is sound, the more emotional part, and
yes.
especially the music. And there is a theory behind it. I don't know if it's true, but I have heard or read that basically because we have two main senses, which is visual sense and our hearing. And because the hearing is slightly less developed than our visual sense, then we perceive it more emotionally. We are more logical about what we see and more emotional about what we hear. And that's why the emotions, the main emotions, we get through our ears. And that's where the sound has its position and where it has its meaning in the filmmaking, I guess.
Well, there's a theory about that, which Walter Murch talks about, which is that the first sound to be developed, first sense developed in our mother's womb is hearing, because
Yeah,
the
that's
baby
right.
can hear the mother's heartbeat, they can hear the swishing of the fluid, and then they can hear outside and they can respond to sounds. And as soon as we're born, our eyes open and they're frontal faced, the sound goes in the background. But now, in dealing with people with Alzheimer's or dementia, they put on headphones and play the music of their youth, whatever was that dynamic, fun music that they had in their primal years. people come alive. And they say it's because that's at the sound starts at the base of the brain in the most primal section. So what we're looking for in sound design is, what is that primal feeling we want to create? And you, the audience, are being led into a soundscape that immerses you in emotion.
Yeah, actually, this is really wonderful opening of the film. This kind of a metaphor to the child's birth, and then you very smoothly shift into this wonderful diagram that mirrors the sound in the film to the different parts of the orchestra. It's called Circle of Talent in your film.
Yes.
So can you tell us who come up with this? And maybe I have later, after you answer, I have a practical question on you, Pavel.
Well, I sort of came up with that because I was listening to the different people describing, I think for the general audience, even people who are a member of the film industry, they do not know why there's so many credits at the end for sound. They don't know what sound people do. And also, for the longest time, sound had 2 Oscars, and people were like, why? Last night, they combined them to 1 Oscar. But the bottom line was this quote that Walter Murch had, that when he was designing Apocalypse Now's sound team, he realized he had to create it like an orchestra. And that certain people were in charge of certain sounds, ambiances or sound effects or dialogue or whatever. And so he diagrammed an orchestra and how, when an orchestra was finally finalized into what it is as we know it today, they figured out that the brass had to be on one side and the violins and cellos had to be on the other side, etc. And you put the percussion in the back. That had to be discovered. Somebody had to figure that out, or else it's going to be too uneven and not present the best sound possible. And so that's what Walter Murch discovered. And when he used the diagram of the orchestra, he was just explaining it to us. I thought, what if we actually segue from an orchestra and then show the departments of sound? And that will help us explain why there are so many sound, just how complex it is and why there's so many specialties. And so that's what led to the Circle of Talent diagram. There was also a woman named Terry Dorman, who is a leading dialogue editor, much beloved in the industry. And she would often use the term, the circle of talent, because her dialogue, which she was so expert at, would leave her and she'd say she'd watch all of it go through the circle of talent. So we combined those 2 concepts.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out for the viewers and the audience that there is not just one sound. And I really hope that the Circle of Talent can prove them wrong, that it's not just a sound. It's sound and music and many effects. And back to my question on you, Pavel, because you made this wonderful film by Václav Marhoul, The Painted Bird, which is specific in a way that it uses the sound and no music at all until the very end of the film. So I want to ask you more about how the absence of one or the other, the sound or music, affects the work and how it affects the sound of storytelling.
Well, I would say that The Painted Bird is special also because it almost doesn't have any dialogue. There is very little of it. It's
That's
about
true, yeah.
dialogue. So it's very unusual movie by all aspects. And I would say that because of that, it has the heaviest emphasis is there on sound effects and ambiences. And basically what we try to achieve with the director, Václav Marhoul, was to create, we considered a camera, like the picture, that it's kind of zoomed whole world and see only bits and pieces of the world, and everything else you just hear. That's why we have mixed it in the immersive audio format, Dolby Atmos, to create the feeling of the whole space around you, but you see just small parts where the camera shows you. And I would say that even the editing is special because some of the most brutal moments you don't see, you just hear them. And because you hear them, sometimes you have a goosebumps because you imagine how it looked
Yeah.
because you didn't see it. So that's why this movie is quite unusual, and it's very unique. And I don't think I will be working on such movie like that. But this movie, for example, was done in a very big team. It was 24 people who was working on that film, and there is a big credit to everybody there because we really worked like a big team, and that was kind of unusual experience. And the lack of music meant that we had to create emotions in the sound, which normally is carried usually by the music. So that's why it was very unusual.
Mm.
Pavel, maybe you can talk about this. We had many directors like Peter Weir and Ang Lee, and then the team was talking, Mark Berger was talking about Milos Forman, that the final mix is when you have all the departments come in with all their work, you know, sound effects, ambiance, you know, all kinds of it. And then you have music. And a lot of times music dominates at the end, and you just want to surrender. And, you know, the composers are very famous and figures, and you think, well, okay, I just give it all to the music. And in several stories I heard from major directors is that once they heard all the mix, they would say to the let's take the music out. Even in the case of Peter Weir with Maurice Jarre, who is a phenomenal, you know, world-class, world-renowned composer, he said the sound design is what we need here. And then in other cases, they would say all this sound design, all this work, and once they got to the final mix, they would just throw it out and say, well, let's let the music do the work. And it would lead to a lot of battles and resentment. Maybe you can talk about that.
Well, there is always a battle, but there is one boss. It's director, obviously. So he should be the one who decides. And to be honest, in my experience, the biggest music composers I have ever met, they were not pushing their movies, their music to be upfront. They did the music, and they knew that the music is part of the soundtrack, and they made the music. They said, "This is what I have done. I know it's part of the whole soundtrack. It's one of the bits. So do whatever you want to do with it. I trust you that the director and you will create the mix which the film deserves." And that's usually, I would say, the bigger composer he was more open to have his music but maybe suppressed or changed or moved. Sometimes they are not. Yeah, that's what I would say. So the music has to be one of the building blocks. It shouldn't dominate. Of course, if you have a musical, then it's music. But if you have a film which has all the elements, it should always be done in a way which serves the film, which serves the director and his idea. That's what we all do. We are creating the world for the director. That's how I see it.
Bobette, as a script coach, how do you emphasize the importance of sound in the story development stage before the production starts?
Well, at the time, as a consultant and as you know, I teach screenwriting. At the time, I was really committing myself to how important sound design was. There was this idea that no one should write any sound into a script, that it was all handled in post-production, and the director worked with the composer, and that was it. But then you started looking at people like Hitchcock, who actually he actually created sound design, and that you could write and create the sense of sound in a scene. And it was a very sophisticated and smart way of writing scripts. And I then started working with major and talking to major sound designers like Randy Tom, who runs Skywalker Sound and has won several Oscars like Forrest Gump, etc. And he said the whole point of sound is that it is a story item that is extremely important. And the more you think, as it's 50% of the experience, how the sound will lead the viewer. And then that Spielberg said it is sound that leads the eye. So I started advising people, you know, and showing them the films that do that. I mean, the classic version of that is horror films. You know, if you turn off the sound in a horror film, it's not scary. So you have to be thinking of that in a horror film. And, you know, people don't go through that door because, you know, you can hear the door creaking and the other sounds. But really, it's a very it's once you understand your job is sight and sound, it's creating a landscape of emotions is what you're doing. That's why you're opening people's ears, filmmakers and film students, to the potential of the medium. And during this time, visual effects began to take over in a very big way. Certainly in Hollywood, they're very expensive and extraordinary visual effects, but they really don't work unless the sound design is creating the magic. You can dazzle people's eyes, but the sound design is what takes it to the next level. And so that is the job of the person who wants to be in this business, is to use all of those senses. And that's what I push people to think, what is the sound in the scene? Can you rewrite that? How can we be led into the scene from the point of view of sound? It inevitably makes it more intimate and interesting.
I think it's a very good point in the current visual effects driven production. You are creating sounds for created scenes, basically. If you shot on green screen and then you add all the backgrounds and you add woods, forests, whatever, you have to create it in sound to be believable. Then you believe it. If you don't create the whole soundscape correctly, then the audience doesn't believe it. So that's quite a good point which you have made.
Well, and that was one of George Lucas's big innovations with Star Wars, which was such a turning point in cinema history, was that before Star Wars, all the sound design for sci-fi fantasy was this like eerie Moog music, you know, and it diminished the feeling. They're like B movies. And he wanted it to sound like authentic metal, creaky, like, there's Han Solo slamming his hand on the hood of the Millennium Falcon to get into hyperspace. He wanted it to feel authentic, and he called it the used future. So his point of view was that the more fantastic the look, the more authentic the sound. It had to feel real to this world. And so Ben Burtt came along and created this sound universe, this sound library, beyond what Lucas was asking for. I mean, think about Darth Vader's breathing. He thought about that, and he created that sound of Darth Vader's breathing. And he created the sound of the lightsaber out of authentic sounds in our world. He just blended them. So it feels real. And that's what you're really wanting to do, is make it feel real, but create a new emotional experience.
It's very common that the directors always spend a lot of time with the DOPs. They prepare the storyboards, they prepare the technical script, maybe some animatics. So with the sound designers and sound men and women, how does it work? Is there something like a script made just for the sounds? Maybe Pavel, can you tell us more about how you work with directors in the pre-production stage?
Again, it depends, but there are directors which think about sound and which consider sound so important that they basically prepare it in the script, or definitely in the technical pre-production phase. So we talk about that a lot. For example, The Painted Bird, we have talked about how the movie should sound a lot before it was even shot. But then still you have the movie, you watch it, and then for me that's when you start to hear how it should sound, and it may be different from the script, because then the visual somehow creates the feeling what the film is asking for. That's what I like to say, because every movie, every feature film has a certain sound which it should have. You know what I mean? It's difficult to describe, but you have to hear it first, and then you try to create it.
Mm.
You hear it in your head, and then you are trying to achieve it, which you never can. It's always worse, but you try to.
Yeah, you
Mm.
do.
That's how
You try.
everybody works.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm asking because Bobette's film show this very huge and important relationship between director and sound designer. So maybe, and I'm happy that you both are lecturers at schools. If you can tell us your point of views on how American academical system and Czech academical system prepares the students of directing in perceiving sound as implemented part of the storytelling.
Well, in the United States at USC, and I think it's different in different programs, every student has to make a series of short films. And the first film is all visual, no dialogue, just to make them start thinking of visual storytelling. And then the second short film, they can have sound effects so that they start layering in, how do I add to the visuals? And then by the third or fourth film, they add in dialogue and they can mix in music. So it's a layered experience. And they have to work the crew. So they actually have to learn how to operate a Nagra recorder in the field, hold the boom. They have to learn, and they have to then edit sound with picture. So they learn all the steps so they respect the steps. And then typically the students then spin off and focus on the expertise development in a certain field, whether it's cinematography or sound or directing or writing. In my case, it was writing and producing was what I focused on, but I had to learn all those steps. I had to learn how to edit my own films and then all the steps of delivering the film. And so therefore you can communicate with the whole team. And but at USC, they have a very refined level of sound education that's, I think, one of the best in the world. And it's extraordinarily complex. Ultimately, if you focus on that, all the steps that you learn in sound mixing and sound designing. And, you know, it's a 2 or 3 year program that people go through. How about for you, Pavel?
Well, I would say that we have a different way of teaching it because from the start, all students are basically students of their department. So students of sound department, they studied sound. Students of directing, they studied directing from the very beginning. Obviously, they make a films together. So they there is a crew which is consisting of basically everybody who is needed for the production, which is good. On the other hand, sometimes I would say that it would be beneficial if the departments would mix a little bit more because, for example, the students of directing, they focus very much on story, on storytelling, on story writing, and they don't have that much time to look into what other departments do. On the other hand, for example, students of editing, sometimes they do their own films where they really focus on the editing aspect of it. And those films are usually the most interesting from the sound point of view because they feel the written, they feel how sound is interesting. So for example, for students of sound, those short films done with the students of editing are sometimes more interesting and they can open them more doors than sometimes films done purely to create or to make some story. So I would say there are different approaches to that, and there could be some middle ground, which would be possibly the best, I would say.
One thing I will say, like we experienced at USC, the reason why we made the film ultimately is that most people have no ears for sound as a storytelling tool. They think it's technical. And therefore, students who come to USC to study film, they think, oh, yeah, sound, you know, it's going to be a technical exercise and I'm just going to learn how to, you know, fiddle the knobs and, you know, play with the mix board. When we finally show them the potential of sound as a storytelling part of the process, it's like literally their mind completely explodes. That was my experience. And so now with the film, we're seeing many more students saying, I want to go in that direction. I want to study that, because they come in appreciating it as opposed to dismissing it.
Mm. Yeah, great. Thank you for those insights on how different ways is applied in different countries. There is one question from the audience, from Jakub. Thank you very much for asking, because he was quite interested in something that we discussed a few minutes before. The question is, since we were on the topic of lies and illusions, is there such a thing as truth on the screen? And if there is any point in searching it at all?
Yes, I think that, I think, was it Picasso who said, somebody who said that art lies in order to show you the truth?
Yeah.
I mean, what do you mean by truth? Ultimately, is, do you want things as reality and your face says it? Because reality is just a very thin veneer of your perception versus someone else's perception. But art is creating a complex understanding of the world that opens your heart and mind. So I think we're always, to me, the issue is that we're always asking a question in storytelling, and we're taking people on a journey. Mm-hmm. And as you go on that journey, whether it's an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, you are being led into different dimensions of the question, whatever the question of the story is. And you're saying to yourself, would I do that? What would I respond to in doing that? And the complex stories, well told, make you immerse yourself into a whole new way of thinking about something. It's not just, it is what it is. Otherwise, why watch a movie if it is what it is? And there's no, it's not a journey, it's not a new insight. And I think we're always looking for a new insight as well as a new experience.
Yeah, absolutely agree, because basically the universe we live in is endlessly complicated, and we are not able to perceive all of that by no means. And I would say that with the film, you are excerpting little pieces and you are treating them and showing them in a way which you can think about. So I would say that it's not about what's real or what's not real, because if it feels real for you at the moment and it somehow speaks to you, that's all it is about for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's literally sort of breaking down our ego in order to see something from a whole new point of view, so that we're not saying yes or no to something. We are actually being led into an aha moment.
Well, there is one wonderful example from the latest Oscar season, because the movie Mank by David Fincher is a very specific example of this kind of illusion, quasi-realistic, authentic way how to approach the sound design. I think that you both saw the film. Just for our viewers, it was recorded as clean as possible, and later in the post-production, they made this like a patina, vintage, dull, noisy, echoic kind of a sound of the sound. So can you tell me what do you think about this? Because from my perspective, it's more of a stylistic form than like a story-driven form.
Yeah, I think there are purists who would say, well, they didn't hear, they didn't. In that era, the sound projection was mono in the theater, and also it was nowhere near the sophistication of clarity of sound that we have now. Mm-hmm. So I think to immerse people into the sound of that era is actually a trial on our perceptions, because we're now used to a better way of hearing the world. I think if you spend a little bit of time to create that experience, the audience gets a perspective like, aha, wow, that's what it was like. But do we need to spend 2 hours in that? And that is a director's choice, but it can be exhausting to the audience. It can alienate the audience, and you have to think who's your audience, and are you wanting to be a purist, or are you wanting to give them an experience of that era? And that's a choice you make as a storyteller.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, you know, there is also one different aspect, not only technical, and it's the experience of the audience. If you play the movie from 60s, there are certain routines being used. The sounds are used in a certain ways. Obviously, there have been breakthroughs, like, for example, Star Wars, because nothing, or Apocalypse Now, no sound was done in the way like it was done before. Or we can speak about Full Metal Jacket. It's also a breakthrough movie, etc., etc. But before that, the audience was used to something, and if you would play immediately to them the modern sound, they would not like it, I guess, because it would be too harsh. Now we are used to very dynamic, abrupt changes. We cut the music in the middle. It was something which was absolutely forbidden, to cut the music in the middle. It has to end in a certain ways because the audience was used to it. So that's also aspect. In which time do you make that movie? And I usually see it when we do a restoration of old movies. You immediately see that the approach was different. Sorry, Bobette. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's where, Barbara Streisand being in our film was a revelation to us as well as to her. But what we kept hearing was that when Barbara Streisand she was so powerful as a singer, and she had her film Star is Born. And when she heard that she could make the post-production better, she put her own money into a very long mix. Now, that had never been heard of before. Before, it was very quick, several weeks, they'd mix a film, but she cared about the sound, not only the music, but also the experience of these stadium experiences of hearing and watching a rock concert, and then the intimacy. So she took that so seriously and transformed the entire sound industry to care about stereo sound and mixing. And that was for a straightforward Barbra Streisand film, love story with music.
Mm.
And the audience so appreciated it that they began to expect that. It wasn't just the big action films, and which has its own audience for that kind of sound experience. It was everyday kind of common comedies and dramas suddenly were transformed. And as Pavel said, the audience now expects that sort of complexity and dimension. If we went back to mono, and with no Dolby noise reduction, it would be, I've seen those films. They are so grating on our ears. We can't sit there for very long.
Yeah, they are. There is a lot of distortion, which is definitely tiring to your ears. Yeah, that's right.
And also the over reliance on music. And now when you see the old movies, you're like, wow, and now we expect, a dynamic range of music, sound effects, so the use of silence or what seems like silence. And the audience appreciates that. It gives it a breathing experience. They don't know it, but they're having a better time. So.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Pavel, you worked on many historical films. So did you ever face making something to sound different than when it was made nowadays?
Well, if you're asking about restoration, the restoration is something which you have to try to just restore the sound. You are basically forbidden to add anything which wasn't created at that time. And sometimes it is quite difficult to discern what was in the original soundtrack and what's basically technical error of the storage, or etc., etc. So you have to understand quite deeply the techniques which were used at the time. So if there is a bad edit and you know it is edit, you have to keep it there because it was in the original soundtrack. And if it's technical glitch which was created later on, then you can remove it. So you have to know and understand the technique which the sound designers at the time could use and how they were using it. Because when you clean the sound, we can hear kind of very technical big technical errors, which because they didn't have the means to hear them. Basically, they didn't have the equipment. So that's why it's sometimes interesting. But you have to be true to the original. You have to try to be as true as you can.
Yeah. There's also the element of, these remastering events, like directors who go back and recreate the film that they would like to have created, but they are deciding, Apocalypse Now Redux, which Coppola did 2 years ago, has a different sound mix than the original Apocalypse Now. And I imagine that's true for other films. I know that George Lucas, when he redid Star Wars, which is now Star Wars 4, of course, he was also adding some visual effects. And the audience who loved the original Star Wars were like, no, don't do all that. We liked the way it was. So, you're playing with an affection that the audience has for why they originally fell in love with the film. I mean, there's an element of like, let it alone, leave it as it was,
Yeah, and that's I would say is a big difference between European and American approach in this one, because in Europe you are absolutely strictly trying just to clean and restore the sound, where in US you remaster it, so you create a different sound mix which was done before. Yeah, that's
Yeah, we are slowly approaching the end of this discussion, but there is one thing I really want to know, since we talk about the way how the audience consume the films right now. We are witnessing, since the boom of streaming services and VOD platforms, that people and vast majority of the audience is watching the films on computers, on televisions with very poor sound system. Maybe they are watching it on headphones. So how has this kind of shift from the cinema consuming of the films has shifted, maybe even story-wise, and maybe in the sense of the work of the sound designers, who simply must count with the fact that their films might not be seen in the cinema halls?
Well, I think Pavel could speak more to that, but what I've heard from great sound teams and great sound designers is how frustrating it is to put all this extraordinary work and then have it, fed through just one speaker on your smartphone. And there are some very interesting mixes that I can hear on my computer and I can hear on my earpods, etc. But I think what I understand is the amount of hours and energy put into the complexity of sound you're going to hear on the big screen. It's not yet possible unless you have a very expensive high-end TV at home with a good sound system. And it just depends on if you want to invest in that. Otherwise, I feel like it still creates an integrity to the storytelling. I still feel like it matters. And that eventually home technology and smartphone technology will take us to a new level. Tom Holman, who we interviewed briefly in our film, is a genius engineer who taught at USC, but he worked with George Lucas, decided that he wanted audiences to have the same experience in the movie theater as they have on a sound stage, a mixed stage. And so he commissioned Tom Holman to create THX. And that was the first time movie theaters were retrofitted and made to have, mixed stage sound design. And then there was a big campaign, the audience is listening, and that was electrifying. And then eventually Dolby came along, superseded that, and now we have Dolby Atmos cinemas and all that. But the audience had to be led, the movie operators, exhibitors had to be forced into making their actual theater experience better for the audience. They didn't want to spend the money. They thought, one speaker in the front for mono is fine. And once the audience began demanding it, then that became the norm. So I think that Tom is apparently now working at Apple and trying to design all of Apple's products to have this really high-end sound experience on many levels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very nicely said. And I think that what you have ended with is the most important. That if audience demands it, then they get it. And
Yeah.
I would say that Apple is one of the makers who really care about sound in their product. So even if you have an iPad, it has a 4 speakers and it has a pretty decent sound system. So you can watch on iPad and you can have a really good experience. Or if you have their AirPods, they actually can do binaural sound. So it is very close to Dolby Atmos. So Apple cares about that. So I recommend, if you can't go to the cinema, if you don't have a decent sound system, at least watch it on Apple.
Yeah, I would say, yeah.
Okay, so I think that maybe we can finish it with something that bridges this topic to my final question, and that's maybe rather provoking, but I'm really interested in what is your opinion, what is your point of view of the future of sound in the film? Because we mentioned the creativity behind Barbara Streisand, Ben Burtt, Walter Murch, all those like visionary minds in using the sound and developing the sound techniques and evolving it into something more than just something that we perceive with ears. So do you expect that it's going to be evolving more in the direction of the audience needs or the sound designers needs and those visionaries needs?
Well, ultimately, it's the audience. I mean, the audience doesn't know what they want until you start to give it to them and they're like, give me more. And I think it's a relationship, like Sound of Metal won the big sound Oscar last night. And it deservedly so, because they take the audience into the experience of a man losing his hearing, but he's also losing his sense of self, who he is as a man in the world, and he struggles with addiction. And so they use the sound design to experience his journey of discovering his humanity. And to me, that was very similar to Elephant Man, which was, 30, 40 years ago. I think the audience responds to great stories well told. And if sound has now all the tools, all the technical tools to create that journey, it's just a matter of the sound team, the director with the sound designer, respecting what sound can do and experimenting with it, because it's the sky's the limit. I can only imagine greater stories.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah, great. Thank you both very much for joining this discussion. I really enjoyed it. I hope that our audience has enjoyed it as well. Bobette, thank you very much for connecting from Los Angeles. And thank you, Pavel, for connecting from Prague. You were wonderful guests, and I wish you both good luck with your careers, with your productions. Thank you very much, Bobette, for your film. To our audience, you can still watch it online after the registration in our KineDok Google form. And I wish you all very nice evening and have a great day.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure. I hope to get back to Prague in person someday soon when we can all meet again.
Yeah, you are more than welcome here.
It'd be my pleasure.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you.